Hi, I'm Deborah Haffey, Professor of Communications at Cedarville College. You're going to be watching a video on argumentation and debate. There will be some lecture content, there will be an actual debate for you to watch, and there will be some comments about that debate as we go through it. I hope that this will be beneficial to you and that it will help you as you use the material that you have in booklet form. What I would like to do in the next few minutes with you is to outline and explain more fully some of the things that you have been reading and will continue to read in the booklet that has come with this videotape. First of all, though, let me talk to you about why this is something important for you to study. Debate is a very important preparation for life for a lot of reasons, and I want to share just a few of those with you right now. First of all, it teaches us how to develop our ideas in a competitive, adversarial situation. Lots of times we don't get to present our ideas or develop our ideas with friends. We have to do that with people who are going to take issue with what we say. And debate gives us the opportunity to practice that. The second thing it does is that it requires you to continue on and to try to explain what you think and what you feel and believe, in spite of the fact that you might not be sure that other people are agreeing with you. It also teaches you how to build an argument and to use the ideas of other people, which you find when you're doing your research. It teaches you how to take your own knowledge of your society and the culture in which we live and your own ideas about that culture and society and put them all together to make a cohesive argument about what you think should happen in the world. And it gives you a deeper knowledge in a lot of different areas of society and policy making. And finally, it teaches you personally, it gives you the personal benefit of teaching you how to speak better, to express yourself in a way that other people can understand. It helps you succeed later on in life. There have been educators, businessmen, professors of colleges, politicians, U.S. presidents, U.S. senators, who have all said that they were thrilled that they had actually debated when they were in school, and if they didn't debate, they wish they had. In fact, research shows that 90+% of the people that were asked said that they thought that debate was one of the most important things a student could do in preparation for later life. So I hope that that will encourage you as you go on. It won't always be easy. There are a lot of new things to learn, but at the same time, it's material that will benefit you and stay with you throughout the rest of your career and the rest of your lifetime. One of the things that you've already read about are stock issues. That's the first thing I would like to talk to you about right now. What are the stock issues? Let's review them for just a second, and then let's talk about how the affirmative team and the negative team use those when they're developing their cases. Do you remember that the stock issues are significance, inherence, solvency, and topicality? Each one of these stock issues are common to all policy debates. Whether or not we should adopt a policy is decided based on these questions. Should we adopt or should we abolish the personal income tax? Well, that will be determined based on whether or not there is a significant problem and whether or not we can get rid of the problem or we have to change the policy in order to get rid of the problem. It will be determined on whether or not we can solve the problem and have extra advantages that are better than what we have right now. And finally, we have to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. Actually, this is the first thing we do. We have to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, so we make sure we're defining our terms and we're consistent with our arguments throughout the case. Often, you'll find that you can use some of these same stock issues when you're writing research papers or term papers in your other school district, in your other school assignments. I find that I use these when I'm writing a proposal here on campus. If I'm wanting to ask my boss or one of my authorities for some kind of a program, or I'm making some kind of a proposal, I will often use the stock issues of significance, inherence, solvency, and topicality. What are we all talking about to begin with? These are common questions that we ask before we adopt some new policy. We ask these questions because we want to make sure that before we make a change, there's a good reason to make a change. People don't usually like change, so we ask these kinds of questions. Is the problem so bad that we have to make this change? Do we really need this change? And those are questions that deal with significance. We might ask, can't we just fix what we already have? Could the problem be caused by something other than what the other people are saying the problem is caused by? And those are issues or questions that come from the issue of inherence. If we ask the questions, how shall we fix this problem? Or who should be in charge of taking care of this problem? How much will it cost for this solution? What happens if people won't cooperate with us? Can this idea even work? Will we be any better off when we're done than we were when we started? All of those are issues of solvency, of actually finding the plan that we want to put into the policy and trying to make that plan work. And finally, we would ask ourselves things such as, are we all talking about the same thing? And are you including what you should be including when you use that term? And now you said that you were going to talk about personal income tax. Have you really talked about that the whole time, or have you changed subjects? And those are issues of topicality. All of these things have to be answered, as I said, before we agree to adopt a new policy. And debate is structured so that the affirmative team must answer all of these questions early in the very first speech of the debate. That is the groundwork that is laid by the very first speaker, and then other speakers will use what that first speaker presents for their speeches to analyze and to critique what's been said. We need to know, first of all, what we're talking about, second of all, whether the idea is even worthy of consideration, and third of all, whether the idea is complete. When the affirmative team accomplishes all of this, they have adequately presented what your textbook, what your booklet calls a prima facie case. A prima facie case is a Latin term, and it means on the face of it or at first glance. When we're talking about a prima facie case, we're saying that there is good and sufficient reason for believing what the affirmative team has told us. And unless someone gets up and argues against what the affirmative team says, then we should agree with them. There's no reason not to. This is what we call an absolute voting issue, and that means that if you do not present a prima facie case in the first affirmative speech, you cannot win the debate. That's why it's so important for you to get an early grasp on what the stock issues are and how they work and how you will incorporate those into your case. Now, is there any other place in life where you can use this? Well, I would suppose that when you go to your parents to ask them for permission to do something or for a new privilege that you haven't had before, they are going to expect you to answer some of these stock issues. They are going to say, what is the need for us to let you do that? Why do you think that it's important for you to be able to do that? That doesn't seem very important to us. You need to make us see that that's important. Or cannot you learn what you need to learn some other way? Is this so necessary that you can only get the benefits through getting this privilege or this possession or this permission for whatever it is you want to do? And how are you going to accomplish this? When will you be home? How much will it cost? What happens if something goes wrong? Will we be able to get in touch with you? Those are all issues of the plan, right, or of solvency. And, of course, when I say 9 o'clock, do you mean 9 o'clock? Are we talking about the same time period? These are all the same kinds of issues that you'll find you use all of the time, even in your daily life. The first affirmative speaker must address all of these stock issues in order for the affirmative team to win. This rule encompasses both the requirement of a prima facie case and the requirement of the affirmative burden of proof. Now, do you remember reading about that? The burden of proof talks about how the affirmative team must speak first, and they must set out their case, and they must prove it with arguments and with reasoning and with evidence. And when they have done all of that, they have fulfilled the burden of proof, the affirmative burden of proof. Now, after that's been done in the very first affirmative speech, every speaker after that must prove what they say. It's not as if only the very first speaker has to do that. Everyone must do that. But the first speaker carries a very great responsibility to make sure that happens at the very beginning of the debate. The first affirmative constructive speech is usually about 8 minutes long. It begins by defining terms and by explaining any necessary analysis of the resolution. And that's what we call topicality. Now, topicality is also another absolute voting issue, which means that the affirmative team must define the terms, and they must explain any necessary analysis of the resolution which comes along. Once they do that, the rest of their case in that first 8 minutes must be consistent with what they've said right in the very beginning. Everything has to fit together like the pieces of a puzzle. And if those pieces don't fit, then the affirmative team is considered not topical and they cannot win. So there are some pretty straight limitations put on the first affirmative speaker to make sure that this is going to work well. The next two stock issues I want to talk about together, and they are inherency or inherence and significance. They are proven in the first affirmative speech when the first affirmative speaker talks about harms. Now the harms are problems that are in our society. And these problems have to be really big. We have to see how many people are being hurt or how deeply they're hurt. So you have to have a lot of numbers or you have to have a lot of harm for a few people, one or the other. And that has to be proven in the first speech. You could also talk about what kind of important values are being violated by this harm that's being discussed. Next, for inherency, the affirmative team must show that these problems cannot be changed inside our current system. And the term often used for current system is status quo, present system. If these problems are so much a part of the present system, like think of a marble cake where you have the vanilla cake and the chocolate cake mixed together. You can't really cut those apart. If you had a vanilla layer and a chocolate layer, then you could separate the two layers. But with inherence, you can't do that because they've been marbled together. And to get rid of one, you also get rid of the other. To get rid of the problem, you have to get rid of the current system because they're interlinked so totally, so completely. That's the only way that we can fix or change the system. And those two stock issues, inherence and significance, are dealt with in the harms. When we move to the plan, we've moved to solvency. Solvency is proven by presenting a plan for change and the advantages which will follow if that plan is actually put into place. This is an area of creativity for the affirmative team based on the research that they've done. You have to be able to find those elements that have been talked about by experts in the field that fit together, that can actually solve this problem. You probably won't find it all in one article. You're probably going to have to do some digging and putting together in order to come up with the solution that you would like to present. You have a lot in your booklet on the plan and the planks of the plan. I'll come back to it a little bit later, but I don't want to spend very much time on that right now. And finally, once you have all of that in place and you have your plan up there and you've shown that it works, oh, and I need to talk to you about advantages. You have to have these advantages there too. And you have to show that the advantages can only come from the affirmative case, from the affirmative plan. That's another type of inherence that comes into play. They're called advantages being unique to the affirmative plan. You cannot allow the negatives to claim that they can get those advantages in the status quo because then there's no reason for what you want to do. And finally then, you have to show that all of this is topical, that the resolution and the way you define the resolution early in the speech allows you to develop this case the way you've developed it and come up with this plan and these advantages as you have. And when you have done that, then you have fulfilled all of the stock issues. While the first affirmative speaker must address all of those stock issues in that very first speech, some of the details can be left by her to be picked up by her partner later on in his speech, in that second affirmative constructive speech. The second affirmative speaker should use the same outline that his partner used in her speech. Just take the outline and take out the evidence and then find new evidence that makes the same point. Fill that new evidence for the second affirmative speech in there, and those are called extension arguments or extension evidence. That's what you want to have prepared ahead of time. The 2AC, or the second affirmative constructive, will not have as long a speech as the first speaker did because he has other things that he must do. But he should use the same outline that his partner used in her speech. Now, how do you go about writing these extensions? There are three things you do. You want to make sure you add evidence for every point which you think is strong that will help you win. Second, you would want to add evidence for areas that are going to be attacked or have been attacked in the past or you predict will be attacked by the first negative speaker. And third, you would want to add evidence on those arguments that might be attacked by the second negative speaker so that you can preempt those arguments and have some strength already in your case before those arguments actually come. The second affirmative speech is the second and final 8-minute constructive speech that the affirmative team has. So any new arguments which the affirmative wants to offer in the round must be done by the end of that second affirmative speech. The first affirmative speech is planned ahead, it's written out, it's read to the audience, to the judge. But it has to be read in a way that is interesting and easy to follow, and it has to be pretty much the same every time, because you have to get all of that information in, and you don't want to leave it to chance that you might forget some of it. Now, the second speech is planned ahead in that the second affirmative takes the same case outline. But even though you have new evidence and with the same outline, you must remember that this is not a speech that you just read. You must have more give and take in this speech. The second affirmative speaker must be more flexible in this speech than the first affirmative was in hers. His speech must adapt to what the first negative has said against the affirmative case and what the first negative has said in support of the status quo. So I usually tell my students to make your extensions 4 to 4.5 minutes out of that 8 minutes, and keep the other 3.5 to 4 minutes for time to refute what the first negative has said in his or her speech. Can you begin to see how debate really does demand that we learn how to combine knowledge of a subject and understanding of what's good and bad involved in that area and our own creative problem sharing? It does take a lot of energy to put a case like this together when you're beginning. But once you have it together, the true enjoyment comes, or a lot of the enjoyment comes, in taking it someplace and actually arguing against someone else. And you really, truly will benefit. You'll find the benefit in a lot of different areas as you use these skills in other subjects that you're working with. Now let's switch from the affirmative team and talk about the negative team some, and what the negative team does to try to counter what the affirmative team has said to this point. The negative team divides their responsibility in order to try to conquer the affirmative. So I will talk about each one of the speeches separately, as I just did for the affirmative. With the first negative, the first thing that the negative team has to do is to decide whether or not they believe the affirmative team was topical. If they think the affirmative team was topical, then fine. They go on with the rest of the case. They accept the definitions, or they ask questions about the definitions, but there's not a large topicality attack. If the negative team has decided that they believe the affirmative team was not a topical, then they must run the topicality attack. That's always the first thing the first negative does. Very first thing. You don't want to forget that, because if you win the topicality argument, you can win the whole debate. Therefore, you want to make sure that you get it in and you spend the right amount of time on it. Decide that together, you and your partner. This should not just be a decision by the first negative. And once you have made that topicality attack, you must argue topicality in every speech until it's dropped by one side or the other. You cannot make the argument once and expect it to stick. First negative, second negative, first negative rebuttal, second negative rebuttal. You keep bringing the issue up. If the affirmative team drops it somewhere along the way, dropping means they ignore the argument, or they forget to, they fail to meet your argument, to refute your argument. If the affirmative team drops the argument, then you point that out to the judge, because that is a point against them. That's a mark against them for having dropped the argument. You can accept or reject their definitions. You can decide that based on whether or not you think the definitions are fair, grammatically correct, etc., that list of what makes a good definition in your booklet. You use that to make your decision whether or not you're going to accept or reject the definitions. You have the right, and you have the responsibility, actually. If you reject the definition, you must redefine the term. So even on the negative, you should always have a list of definitions of each term in the resolution that you can live with. Then, after you've done that, you want to look throughout the case, and you want to see if every term in the resolution is implemented in the affirmative case. For instance, with the personal income tax resolution, are they actually talking personal income tax in the case, or do they go into corporate income tax? Do they talk about some other things instead? If they move into corporate taxes and they don't talk about personal income tax, then they're not topical. And you would make that topicality argument because they have not been consistent. Remember, we talked about that a few minutes ago. All right, and once you have finished with definitions and the topicality issues, the next thing the first negative does is go to the issues of harms. You want to show with these harms, which were presented by the first affirmative, that first of all, they are not significant, and second of all, they are not inherent. Let's talk about significance first. You can attack this in a lot of different ways. You can attack their evidence, you can attack their numbers, you can attack their statistics, you can attack their sources, you can give conflicting evidence. Whatever this problem is seriousness, the greatness of the problem, you need to chip it down, get it smaller so it's manageable. If they keep that problem really big and really significant, it's more difficult for you to prove later on that the present system can take care of that problem. So you want to get it down smaller, first of all. Second of all, you need to show them that we can solve this problem in the current system or the present system. That with taking some of the mechanisms that we already have in our policy making, in our government, in our society, in our economic structure, and repairing those things, we can solve the problems. We don't have to go to a completely new plan that we don't know will work, whether it will work or whether it won't work. The second negative speaker, I'll just say this now so that you hear it now, and maybe I'll get back to it later, maybe I won't. The second negative speaker does something like this with the advantages. He or she wants to argue that the advantages are not inherent to the affirmative plan. In other words, we can get the advantages in the current system. Yeah, that's a really nice advantage, and you know what? We can get that too. We don't have to adopt this affirmative plan to get that. It's not unique to the affirmative plan. We also have that. When the first affirmative has done these two things, has talked about topicality definitions, and has talked about the harms, and has dealt with the issues of significance and inherence underneath harms, then he or she can do one of two things. You can, first of all, talk about what is good about the current system and why the current system should be kept, the advantages that come from the system that we have right now, and what advantages do we have right now that we would lose if we make this change that the affirmative team is asking us to make. Then also, you can go down through the plan to some extent and show some beginning plan attacks. You can ask questions about the plan, you can show problems that you see are going to crop up with this plan, and you start to make some initial forays into enemy territory on that plan and try to make some attacks there. Plan attacks focus on plan planks, and those are listed in your booklet. They are agency, enforcement, mandate, and funding, those four things. You want to look at those four. You want to sit and look at your paper where you've taken notes, and you're looking for the chink in the armor. There's not going to be a perfect plan. There is not going to be a perfect affirmative case. You will find the problem if you look for it. Don't panic. You have the time. You know this subject if you've been studying it. Just sit there and look at the points that they made and ask and say to yourself, there's something wrong here. What's wrong? I just have to find what's wrong. That's all I have to do. The next thing you want to do is look to see if any of the elements in the plan are already working in status quo. If we already have them, we certainly don't need to adopt this plan. And then if you can show that the advantages come out of the part of the plan that we already have, then you win, because we don't need what they're asking us to take. If we don't need the plan, they might not even be topical, so consider that again too. The advantages are done by the second negative speaker. Whenever your partner, whether you're first negative or second negative, whenever your partner is up front speaking, you should be using that time to prepare your next speech. You should be looking over your notes. You should be asking yourself, what have we missed? What more can we say? What more can be done here? One of the last things you want to do is look to see if there are any of the elements of the plan which are already working in status quo. If they're already there, then we don't need the affirmative case. you can show that, you can show hopefully that the advantages come out of that, and you will win because there's no reason to make the change. Now the negative team can do one of two things. We've talked about them running a repairs case. That's what we've been talking about. That's what I've been talking about so far. Their other option is to run a counter plan. A counter plan is very complicated, and I'm not going to go very much into it right here, but I want you to know it is an option for the negative team. It's when the negative team develops another affirmative case and says, oh, you're right, we have all these problems. And yes, they're terrible problems. But you know what? Your solution won't solve the problem. This solution will solve the problem better. And whatever solution the negative team comes up with must be outside the resolution. They cannot go into the resolution for that solution. Let's go to the second negative finally and talk about what that second negative speaker does. The second affirmative and the second negative both must address arguments that have been made by their partners. So by the time we get to these last two speeches, the second affirmative constructive and the second negative constructive, we should be hearing familiar arguments that we've heard before. They're just being developed more deeply with each speech, more specific evidence, etc. The second negative speaker will begin with topicality if that argument has been made. And then he will begin or she will begin with plan attacks. You don't start where your partner started. You start where your partner stopped, and you finish the rest of those arguments of the affirmative case so that by the time you're done, all of the affirmative case has been spoken of and argued against in the constructive speeches. Once you're done with this second negative speech, you cannot say a new argument. You can't present something new, so you have to get it in now. So you begin with plan attacks. You look for the things that are wrong with the plan, the weaknesses, the places where we can't afford it, the funding is wrong, the enforcement is wrong, the agency is wrong, the mandates are wrong, they've overlooked some of the mandates, etc. Next, the second negative speaker would deny advantages of the affirmative. And as you're denying these advantages, what you're trying to do is show, hopefully, that the advantages are actually disadvantages, that we won't get any advantage from this at all, that actually there are going to be bad things that are going to happen when we put this plan into effect. And we're much better off with the advantages, the benefits that we have in our present system. And we can control those disadvantages, but these new disadvantages we don't even know if we can control. And as you show these things, the disadvantages of the affirmative, deny the advantages of the affirmative, show the advantages of the negative team, what you're trying to do is balance or unbalance the scales so that you have more on your side of the scales than the affirmative team does. As soon as the second negative speaker is finished, the first negative rebuttalist gets up and gives that first rebuttal speech. So you have two negative speeches back to back. You have the 8-minute second negative constructive, and you have the 4 or 5-minute first negative rebuttal. And these two speeches need to be considered together. They're separate, and you have different responsibilities, but they're a block because they come back to back. And you can deploy strategy during this time and actually get well ahead of the affirmative team. In fact, you need to be well ahead of the affirmative team because after the negative block, they have 2 more speeches and you only have 1 more. So you need to be winning by the end of that first negative rebuttal. And you want to make sure, that's why I said a minute ago, to make sure that you are not repeating one another. You want to make different arguments in those 2 speeches. The first negative has his responsibilities, the second negative has her responsibilities, and they don't blend or step on each other unless it's a really strong argument that needs to be made or a really detrimental point that the affirmative has made against the negative case. We've been talking about stock issues and how they apply to the affirmative team and the negative team. Let's move now to how you take notes. I've been referring to that as I've been talking to you, but we haven't gotten very specific yet. When you take notes in a debate, you want to make sure that you can keep track of each argument that's being made by a speaker, when it was made and what was actually said, and if possible, if you have the time, write down a little bit about the evidence also. So you need some space, and you need to be able to see each of the speeches beside the speech that came before it or beside the speech that's coming next. We do that by using a legal-sized pad. It's the preferable length because it's longer, and we make a column for each one of the speeches. The first affirmative speech goes here, of course, and then the first negative, second affirmative, second negative, first negative rebuttal, first affirmative rebuttal, second negative rebuttal, and finally the second affirmative rebuttal, each in order. As you take the notes then, you would have definitions here at the top of the page. When the affirmative or the negative team responds to the definitions, you would put it right across from what the affirmative team said in the column corresponding. Then when the affirmative team comes to talking about the significant harm, and the negative team answers that, that's going to go right here in the negative column. When the second affirmative comes back and argues a position, trying to refute what the first affirmative said and extend what the trying to refute what the first negative said and extend what the first affirmative said, that goes right here in this column, so that the significance argument flows all the way across the sheet in the same place. That way you can look down at any point in the debate and you can see who has said what about the issue of significance. So can I as the judge, and I can follow the progression of that argument the entire time. That's the purpose of being able to say, well, she said, and he said, and he said, and she said, all the way across. Now, who do I think had the stronger argument? You want to be able to learn how to do that. It will take some practice for you, but eventually you'll be able to do this very effectively. Another thing that I would suggest is that you use 2 colors of ink at least. One color for the affirmative team, one color for the negative team. That way you at a glance can look down and say, blue, that's me and my partner. Black, that's the other team. But if you're blue for affirmative, keep it blue for affirmative most of the time. That way when you see blue, it's affirmative. When you see black, it's negative. Another thing you can do is to keep a 3rd color of ink, red perhaps, and use it to make circles and stars, to order your speech, etc., so that when you look down at the paper, everything you need to have is right there at your eye quickly. You don't want to spend part of your speaking time trying to figure out what's on the paper. You want to use all of that time making as many arguments as possible. Organize the flow sheet according to stock issues. Typically, especially when people get better at flow sheeting, they'll put on the first sheet definitions and harms. On the second sheet, they'll put plan and advantages. That way you have lots of room to take notes. New arguments that the negative makes that have nothing to do with what the affirmative team has said go on a 3rd sheet of paper, separate from all of the others. Now, you have all of this information. You look at your paper. You see that the first affirmative team talked about harms. The first negative talked about harms. The second affirmative talked about harms. But in that negative block, the first negative rebuttalist did not get back to talk about harms. When that happens, you take your red pen, draw a big circle. And as the affirmative team, you want to make a strong argument about that. That is a strategic move at that point. Because if they have dropped that argument, they cannot come back in the second negative rebuttal and bring it up again. They have lost their opportunity to talk about that. So at that point, that becomes a negative, or an affirmative argument. And the affirmative team can count that as a win. Now, most judges will let you do that. Of course, you have to remember, judges are judges, and they have their own mind, and they make decisions differently for different reasons. But you at least have the right to argue to the judge that because the first negative rebuttalist dropped that harms argument, the second negative speaker should not be allowed to bring it back up because it's not fair to you. This was your chance to talk about it. Now you can't talk about it. The last thing I want to say about flow sheeting is this. Make sure that when you are writing your speech, you use your column for your speech. If this is your speech right here, use it for your speech. If you write your speech someplace else, you're going to forget what you said. It's not going to be in the order of the debate. It's going to be more difficult for you to be organized. Make sure that you teach yourself the habit. It'll be difficult at first, but you'll get used to it, of looking at the speeches that have gone before you, deciding what you're going to say, writing down 3 or 4 words that will remind you of the argument you want to make, and maybe the number of your evidence, or the first name of the author of your evidence, or something about the tag of your evidence, so that you know where you have to go. And that will help you. In your rebuttal speech, then you can say, but wait a minute, Judge. The other team said I didn't say that, and I did say it. I said it right here, and I used this evidence. And you will remember what you said because you've written it in this column. If it's difficult for you to do that right from the very beginning, one of the things you can use are Post-it notes. You can write your ideas on Post-it notes and then just stick them where they go in the column. And it's an easier way for you to get started. My debaters do that a lot. You can also use them to pass notes back and forth between you and your partner, and you don't get in trouble for talking to one another during the debate. Now, cross-examination. Cross-examination is a short period of time after each constructive speech where the speaker must answer questions about what he or she has just said. The purpose of this period is to clarify the other team's case. It's to ask questions for understanding. It's to probe for weaknesses in the other team's case. And it's to try to strengthen your own case. You will not make yourself a great trial lawyer by being harsh or pushy or obnoxious during this time. That's often the temptation of a new debater. The only person who is going to make a decision is sitting in the back of the room, and that's the judge. So what you want to do is convince the judge that you are reasonable and moderate and that you have thought through these things and that you're the kind of person that he or she would like to vote for. That's your target person, the judge in the back of the room. The other team is not going to concede that you're right, just like you're not going to concede that they're right. They're not going to give the debate to you. Therefore, during the cross-exam period, instead of turning and talking to the other team while you're asking questions, look directly at the judge and talk to the judge. If you want to look at the person beside you for a moment or two, of course you may turn to look, but don't allow yourself to fall to the temptation of standing and talking to that person the whole time. You know how you don't like this when I'm doing it right now. And if you were the judge, you wouldn't like it anymore. Seldom is a debate won on the basis of cross-exam. You are not a highly paid trial lawyer, as I was saying a minute ago. You're not going to break a case. You're not going to reduce a witness to tears at the front. The very few times that I've heard that it happened, the team that perpetrated the tears usually lost because the person crying gets a sympathy vote from the judge. So it's not even effective. The judge will want you to be polite, respectful of other people involved, including the judge. He or she will want you to show that you understand your case and that you understand the resolution. You are expected to handle cross-examination with poise and to answer well. And that's really what it's all about. It's an opportunity to show that you can handle yourself under pressure with a certain amount of poise. You are not allowed to look to your partner for help when you have to answer a question. You're up there on your own, so you have to know the case well enough that you can answer the questions yourself. To look to your partner for help is called tag teaming. That's not allowed. All of this boils down to, finally, after you have worked on your case and put it together and come up with a good idea and argued it well and taken good notes and had a good cross-examination that was effective, the last thing that you need to consider is how do you speak to your audience? How do you treat that person out there listening or those people out there listening to you as you speak to them? Let me give you about 4 or 5 pointers about delivery, and then we'll be done. First, use your time well. Take a few seconds before you go up to give your speech and look over your notes and double check your plan. Check the order of your evidence to make sure that you have it in the right order so that when you're on point 2 on your flow sheet, you have the evidence that goes with it at that moment so that you don't get everything mixed up when you're in front. A very few seconds of just double checking everything before you go to the front of the room to give your speech can make a world of difference. Second, even when you get excited or angry or you're beginning to despair, work very hard at keeping a clear head. That is one of the most important things you can learn in the competition of debate. If you aren't thinking clearly, you will not speak clearly. So you want to have your thoughts clear, and you don't want to get your ideas muddled up with getting angry or embarrassed or upset. You have to set that aside and keep going forward. Third, look at the judge as much as possible throughout your speech, even in the first affirmative constructive speech. It is very boring to listen to a speaker who never looks at you. And if you don't look at the judge doesn't think he or she has to look at you. And if they don't look at you, they're not as likely to listen either. So you want to use regular delivery skills that you would use any other time. Good eye contact, looking in the eyes of the person you're talking to, using gestures on the one hand, on the other hand, to help explain your ideas and to keep them in order for your judge. Making a smooth flow of language so that you're not starting and stopping a lot and halting, and being pleasant. Fourth, it is essential, absolutely essential, that you organize your ideas. If you see your judge in the back flipping a paper and writing something down and flipping it and writing and back and forth from page to page, then that tells you that the judge doesn't know where you are in your speech, doesn't know where to write the ideas. If the judge is using a flow sheet, then the judge needs to know where to put these ideas as the time comes. If they're not written in the right place, then that particular statement that you made, that evidence that you read, won't be used in the decision as to whether or not you won the argument. So your organization is really, really essential. That's why you want to start with the first stock issue and work through the stock issues every single speech. I know it sounds like it's not very creative, but it works. It's effective because it helps people organize what you're saying. There are enough other places for creativity in this practice. And finally, practice incorporating evidence when you speak. This is something that is a little unusual. We don't very often do it in conversation. So take up a piece of evidence and skim it over, read it to yourself. This is in practice time. And then kind of make a statement about the evidence and work into reading the citation. John Smith, U.S. News and World Report in May 17, 1997 says, etc. That will help you get the practice of effectively and efficiently using your evidence. Be as natural and as conversational as you possibly can be. Don't try to pretend you are someone or something that you are not, because people will know. What we really want is to know who you are and to get to know you as you speak. And you will not lose if you just show us that you are being yourself and that we are seeing the real person. Well, I know this has been a lot to think about. Eventually, it all becomes second nature to you. I promise it does. Every time I teach this class, I have students who come back to me and say, you know, I have changed my way of thinking because of what I learned in this class. I listen to lectures differently. I listen to conversations from my friends differently. I speak differently when I speak to my friends, when I speak in class, and they are grateful for the change. I think that you will find that the activity of debate competition is practiced for the rest of your life. It will give you the skills that will put you at the front of almost every line. And I really encourage you and hope that you will continue to practice this and work with this in the days to come. I know this has been a lot for you to think about, but now let's go to a sample debate and see how some of these principles are actually put into practice.